it's Jonathan, and welcome to Season 5 of iHeart Movies, Season 4 of Every Version Ever, and Season 2 of the Disney Movie Marathon. New episodes will be coming soon, but before we get back into talking about movies, I wanted to share an update on what's happening with me and what you can expect in the next year. This is going to be a solo episode. It's partially a look back at 2022, as well as a bunch of really big announcements for 2023. I'd originally planned to do this look back portion at the end of last year, but I had a minor medical emergency toward the end of December. Don't worry, I'm fine now. But after that, I decided I needed to slow things down and take it easy for a while. I was already planning to take January off, so I decided I would just save my look back at 2022 and fold it into the first episode of the new year before I officially launch all the next seasons of my shows. I've done this kind of look back / season stats thing before. I originally started doing it on Twitter back when I only did YouTube, and then last year I think I did a looking back episode in January, but I've decided to quit doing the Twitter version altogether and just move it completely to the podcast. I don't know if this is interesting to anyone else, but it's interesting to me, so here we go. So like I said, I started this back in 2017-18 as just a thing I did on Twitter. I was tracking my social stats more than anything, but I'm now a lot more interested in my YouTube and podcast growth and how much content I've created over the year than in how many Twitter followers I have. I literally do not know or care how many followers I have on any of my social media these days. I don't even look at it. That's like one of the only things that I like about the terrible new Twitter layout, that I can't see my follower count unless I go looking for it. I don't care. So for the podcast, for as busy as I was with everything else, mostly my job, I'm kind of surprised at how many episodes I was able to make and that I was able to launch a third podcast last year and crank out a bunch of episodes for it. So let's start with the stats as I stated them on January 1st, 2022. The ones I care about, so no more social media stats, just YouTube and podcasts. At the end of 2021 on my main channel, I had 351 subscribers, and on my Every Version Ever channel, I had 71 subscribers. On iHeart Movies, I had made 120 total podcast episodes, and on Every Version Ever, I'd made 65. And that's all together, not counting any repeats or episodes shared between the shows. I had made 152 episodes. Moving on to 2022, I'll be going by the stats as I copied them down at the end of December. They've gone up a bit since then, but I was doing this from year to year, so that's how I'll continue just to make it easy. So at the end of 2022, I was at 430 subscribers on my main channel, which means I increased by 79 subscribers. Not amazing, less growth than the previous year where I gained 133, but despite the fact that I'm making this episode that's all about numbers, I really don't care that much about subscribers. I'll care more when I hit 1,000 because that's the point I can start making money. However, despite the lackluster growth on the main channel, Every Version Ever grew by a surprising amount, like both the YouTube version and the audio version. My audio version is even monetized now. Granted, the last time I checked, it's only earned approximately $9, but that's more than I make on YouTube. And speaking of YouTube, like I said, last year I was at 71 subscribers. At the end of 2022, I was at 282. And on the Every Version Ever YouTube channel, like I said, last year I was at 71 subscribers. At the end of 2022, I was at 282. I gained 211 subscribers last year. At this rate, Every Version Ever is on track to outgrow the main channel, maybe even by sometime this year. We'll see if it happens. I'm still not convinced that this isn't a fluke, but if uploading a 2+ hour podcast about some obscure 1920s cartoons didn't kill the growth, then maybe it's not a fluke? I guess we will see. On my brand new channel for my brand new podcast, the Disney Movie Marathon, I'm currently only at 7 subscribers, though every episode gets more views than I have subscribers, which is definitely not the case on iHeart Movies and Every Version Ever. Though as it grows, I don't expect that to continue. We'll see. But on the audio version of the Disney Movie Marathon, I have thousands of downloads, and I was monetized within a couple months of launching. I released a podcast early on talking about the new Disney live-action remake of Pinocchio, and for some reason, that thing immediately took off. Last time I checked, it had almost 3,000 plays, and some of those listeners stuck around, so the audio version of the Disney Movie Marathon is currently a lot more popular than the YouTube version. It hadn't quite earned $2 by the last time I'd signed in, but the fact that it was monetized that quickly was pretty cool. Now for the episode stats of each show, this year I made 34 episodes of iHeart Movies, 29 episodes of Every Version Ever, and 25 episodes of the Disney Movie Marathon. Of course, a lot of these episodes are shared between the shows, and most of the new Disney podcast was made in years past on the main podcast, so in total, the number of brand new episodes I made across all 3 shows was 57. In addition to all the stats, I also wanted to talk a bit about some of the best episodes of last year. These are just my personal favorite projects from 2022, and episodes that I think are essential listening. I'm going to put together a podcast playlist for you on YouTube if you missed any of these. I can't do that for audio listeners, but I will have the YouTube link in the description of wherever you're listening to this from. So you can either go and make note of the ones you want to catch up on, or just listen to the playlist on YouTube. It'll be on my main channel, but it'll have links to videos on all 3 channels. First up, one of the very first episodes of 2022 was an extra long one looking at The Last Unicorn with Nikki from Trivial Theater. I hadn't seen that movie since I was a kid, so it was a lot of fun to rewatch and talk about. After that, I did an episode suggested by my cousin Sarah talking about the 2006 short film Sergei Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf. Sarah originally suggested we do that one as a Christmas 2021 podcast, but since it was more winter than Christmas, I decided to wait, and then it ended up turning into an entire series for Every Version Ever. And following the Peter and the Wolf series, as I usually do on Every Version Ever, we did another series on Alice in Wonderland. That seems to be the most popular thing I do across all my channels, so I try to do a few each year, but this year I did a lot, and a bunch of them I thought were some of my best content from the year. Ever since I started my Alice series on YouTube, Wonderland Wednesday on the main channel, which eventually spawned Every Version Ever, 2 of the most requested versions are the 2 miniseries from 1985, the American version with a ton of big-name stars from the time, and the British version with puppets. And last year we did both. Sarah and I did the British version, commonly known in Alice circles as the Anglia version, as that's who originally released it. And then Sarah and I were joined by Nikki for the American version, which turned into a massive 2-parter that was almost 2.5 hours long. In July, I did Christmas in July again, and I invited my friend Rachel Wagner to join me as kind of a crossover with her show, the Hallmarkies podcast. We talked about 3 different Hallmark versions of A Christmas Carol, and we were joined by one of her co-hosts for that episode, Carrie, the author of Hallmark Comics on Instagram. And Carrie and I did a Q&A episode before we did the actual episode, and even though we never met in person, we discovered a very surprising real-world connection. It's just one of those things that makes you realize that it really is a small world after all. An amazing thing that happened for Sarah and I in July turned into a very cool shorter episode of the podcast. We were given tickets to see the new movie Marcel the Shell with Shoes On by the director himself, Dean Fleischer Camp. A chance encounter on Twitter led to him sending us tickets, and I surprised Sarah on the way while we filmed a review of the original shorts. It was so much fun and one of my absolute favorite memories of 2022, and I am so glad to have it on film. After that came the very late look back at animation of 2021. Katie Fabric and I do this every year, but we didn't get to it till over halfway through 2022 this time. But better late than never, and this is always one of my favorite projects of the year, so we have a ton of fun ranking all the animation we watched from the previous year. In September, I finally launched the Disney Movie Marathon as its own podcast, and to kick things off, I did 2 episodes with Eli Sanza and Mark Brown, first talking about a bunch of early Disney shorts, and then talking about the first 5 Disney films, the golden age of Disney, and we each came up with our own ranking. Also in September, back on Every Version Ever, we finally got to another one of the most requested versions of Alice in Wonderland, the Disney version. Sarah and I were joined by my friend Jenna, aka Fandomwise, who is basically an expert in all things Alice and a huge Disney fan to boot, and that ended up turning into another massive 2-parter and was just a whole lot of fun. And speaking of 2-parters, my friend Sam joined me for another episode that turned into 2. She's not a podcaster, she has no online presence, but we love talking about movies, so I've been able to convince her to podcast with me a couple times, and last year we talked about 2 of her favorite movies, Alien and Aliens. I'd never seen them before she convinced me to watch them with her, so it was a lot of fun to talk about them from someone who has never seen them, and someone who's been a massive fan all their life. And then another random shorter episode from Sarah and me. We had talked for ages about going to visit an old, hidden Civil War cemetery that's up in a field near our property, but it's also quite a long walk, at least a field and a half away, inaccessible by any road. And in November, we finally decided to just do it, and film a mini vlog talking about it. And then at the same time, she suggested that we tie it in with a review of the Over the Garden Wall pilot, Tome of the Unknown. Like, barely anybody watched that episode, but it really was one of my favorite things from last year. So if you missed it, definitely check it out in the playlist. Throughout November, I released a few more Alice episodes I did with Jenna. On one, we were joined by Mark and Eli to talk about Disney's Alice comedies, and on the other two, Katie joined us to talk about the Tim Burton adaptation and its 2016 sequel. Those are very controversial films in the Alice fandom, so it was fun to talk about them because we all had very different opinions. I ended up doing a ton of Christmas content in December, but my favorite episode was with Nikki from Trivial Theater and Dan from TYTD Reviews. We talked about Gremlins, and we had so much fun. We actually talked for at least 3 hours, which I somehow managed to cut down to around an hour and 15 minutes, but all those tangents will have to see the light of day somehow in the future, because our conversation was so much fun. And following that, I did episodes with Mark, Nikki, and Katie talking about various versions of A Christmas Carol, including things like the 1970 musical Scrooge and its new animated remake, as well as the new Apple TV movie Spirited. We also talked about the non-Christmas Carol film, The Hip Hop Nutcracker, which was so much better than I expected it to be. And then we finished out the year finally talking about one of my all-time favorite Christmas movies, The Muppet Christmas Carol. And that's what I have for a podcast-related look back at 2022, but while I'm doing this solo episode, something else I would like to do is talk about some of my favorite movies and shows of 2022. I didn't get out to see too many theatrical films this past year, so I don't feel like I have enough to make a really honest top 10 ranking list. Plus, I'm just bad at ranking in general, so I think, at least for this year, I'm not going to do a top 10 list. I will do my yearly animation ranking with Katie Fabric, but I'm going to try and catch up on a lot more animated films I missed before we record that episode. So in no particular order, especially because the animated ones will be ranked later and I don't want to give away that ranking, a few of my favorite films of 2022 have been Pixar's Turning Red, Matilda the Musical, Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, DreamWorks' The Bad Guys, Marvel's Wakanda Forever and Thor Love and Thunder, the Bob's Burgers movie, and Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Those are just the favorites that came to mind first, but a few other movies that I enjoyed well enough were Pixar's Lightyear, Disney's Strange World, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, and Jurassic World Dominion, but those would definitely not make any top 10 lists, and I have a feeling that if I'd seen more movies, some of them wouldn't even make an honorable mentions list. They were fun enough for me to enjoy and probably rewatch at some point, but I wasn't really blown away by any of them or anything. I have a feeling I will eventually do podcasts on all of these at some point, both the favorites and the runners-up. Probably not right away, but I would like to talk about more of these in the future, because I have thoughts on a bunch of them. In the TV realm, I have been so bad at keeping up with my favorite shows, but I did make a concerted effort to watch most Star Wars stuff as it came out. I saw just about every episode of The Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi as they dropped, or I'd catch them like 2 every other week. But at least I kept up with them. I meant to get into Andor, but I was so busy at the time it was airing that I got too far behind, so I decided it would be the first series I watched as soon as I was done with the podcast for the year. And it was amazing. Like, I expected it to be good, and the first few episodes were, but the further I got in, the more it blew me away, and I cannot wait for Season 2. However, by far, my favorite Star Wars thing of the entire year was the animated miniseries Tales of the Jedi. If you're a Star Wars fan, especially of the animated Clone Wars series, you need to check this one out. It gave some amazing backstory to both Ahsoka and Count Dooku, and there's even an episode that focuses on Yaddle, the female of Yoda's species that was previously only briefly seen in the Jedi Council scenes in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. In the animation realm, I watched the new Cuphead show and made a podcast on it, as well as the second season of Centaur World. Those are both great shows, highly recommend for animation fans. I've also watched part of the next season of Primal, which is amazing, but I only recommend it for animation fans who don't mind graphic violence. Like, I usually avoid this kind of content, but with this show, the animation and story is just so good that I'm able to get past the blood and gore because I love the rest of it so much. And for me, that is high praise because I don't give a pass to that for most things. Primal is just amazing. And as far as random live-action TV, I haven't watched much this past year that wasn't part of a franchise, except I think I'm caught up on Abbott Elementary, which is my current favorite sitcom. I love that show and I highly recommend it for any sitcom fans. In the Marvel realm, I am also terribly behind. I did somehow manage to get to all the theatrical films. I really liked Thor Love and Thunder and I loved Wakanda Forever. I wasn't a huge fan of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, mainly due to the direction they took Wanda, but it did have some amazing scenes and I would definitely rewatch it. On the Marvel TV front, I am way behind. At this point, I have literally only watched one Marvel series from 2022, which was She-Hulk, and even that I watched long after it was over. I did finally catch up on the 2 Marvel specials in January, which were amazing. I never knew I needed a buddy comedy following the adventures of Mantis and Drax kidnapping Kevin Bacon, but I am so glad it exists. And Werewolf by Night was a great surprise, more violent than I usually care for, but the fact that it was almost completely black and white really helped make it seem more comic book / old-timey film, and it also helped me get past all the blood. But even if it had been in full color, I think I would have been fine with it, because I love these characters, and I would really like to see more of them in the future. And then back to She-Hulk, I really enjoyed it, unlike apparently the majority of Twitter. I even loved the controversial ending, which I won't spoil, but I know it was absolutely despised by a certain segment of the fandom. I thought it was creative and hilarious, though, so whatever. I also love Star Wars The Last Jedi, so my tastes don't seem to align with most of the online discourse, so I guess just cancel me now, Twitter. I will definitely be catching up on the rest of the Marvel stuff as soon as I can. My friend Sam has been talking up Moon Knight for quite a while now, so I should probably do that first, and then at some point I'll get to Miss Marvel as well. I also caught up on Doctor Who this year. Jodie Whittaker's final season was by far her best. It made me wish we could have gotten more out of her Doctor before we move on, but if she has to go, at least she went on a definite high, and I cannot wait for what's coming next. I think that's probably all I have to talk about for now. I guess my main recommendations from all that are, if you're a Star Wars fan, you need to watch Tales of the Jedi and Andor, and if you're a Marvel fan, watch Wakanda Forever or either of the 2 Disney Plus specials. If you're an animation fan, my ranking will be coming in a month or 2, but I definitely recommend Turning Red, The Bad Guys, and Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, and hopefully I'll find some more hidden gems to recommend when we get to that episode this year. Now, looking ahead to 2023, I have a few big announcements to make, as well as talking about how they will affect this show in the future. Don't worry, nothing is going to fundamentally change, but I will be approaching how I do podcasting a bit differently in the coming year for a variety of reasons, starting with, I'm launching another podcast. I think I hinted about this a few times here and there last year, but I am finally getting ready to launch iHeart Animation as its own show. Back in 2018, before I ultimately decided to pivot completely to podcasts, I briefly rebranded my channel to iHeart Animation and tried to exclusively become an animation review channel. That didn't last very long. By 2019, I decided to pretty much exclusively move into podcasts, but I did keep iHeart Animation as an occasional series on the show, and I would semi-frequently review animated films there. That continued into Every Version Ever because there are a lot of animated versions of things, and of course the Disney Movie Marathon is like at least 80% animated content so far. Well, now all that animated content is going to be its own show. Sometime in the next couple of months, I haven't decided exactly when yet, iHeart Animation will launch as a standalone podcast. All those episodes will still be episodes of their respective podcasts, but they will now also be made with iHeart Animation in mind and will release on whichever podcast they fit into. And that doesn't always mean a simultaneous release. Sometimes episodes will debut on one show before the other, but both versions will usually release within a week or so of each other. And that is because, next big announcement, I'm going to try to have a semi-consistent schedule this year. Emphasis on try. I have tried to do a release schedule in years past to varying degrees of success, but ever since I started the Disney Movie Marathon, it's become more and more apparent that I need to find a schedule that works for me and stick to it, especially since I will now be launching a 4th podcast. As you know, I have a full-time job, which obviously has to come first, and that job does not always have predictable hours. Sometimes I have to work late, and I don't always have time to work on the podcast when I get home. I've always tried to release an episode every week, especially on Every Version Ever, but that has not always worked out, which resulted in a few stretches where I would have to take several weeks off at a time in order to catch up. I think I even had a stretch on Every Version Ever where I only released like 3 episodes over the course of 3 months, and 2 of those came one right after the other, so there was 1 month with absolutely nothing, and I would really like to not do that again. I will likely continue to take Januaries off, as I've been mostly doing that since I started on YouTube. It allows me to catch my breath after the holidays and record a few episodes to get prepared for the next season, but hopefully there will not be as many long breaks throughout the year. But other than taking a month or so off between seasons, I would like to keep a more consistent schedule, which means I think I need to switch to every other week. and I'm going to aim for Mondays just to keep things simple. That's personally when I like to get new episodes of my favorite shows, since I like to listen to podcasts on my way to work and at the gym during the week. Mondays just seem to be an all-around good day to release new content. There will be extra episodes here and there. Sometimes there will be 2 or 3 weeks in a row with episodes, but I think I'm going to stick to the every other week for most of my podcasts. The main podcast, I Heart Movies, is sort of an amalgamation of all the other podcasts with extra episodes here and there. So it will probably come out more often, but for the most part, for all the podcasts, I'm probably going to do every other week with at least 2 or 3 episodes per month. When iHeart Animation debuts, I will probably kick things off with an episode almost every day for the first few weeks, just because I want to build up a good library for new listeners. Those episodes will mostly be ones that listeners to my other podcasts will have already heard before, but they will be new for my new listeners, and I want them to have a bunch to listen to when they first find the podcast. After that, I will probably switch to an episode every week for a while before settling into an every other week routine like the others. Okay, for my final announcement, I'm starting a Patreon. As you can imagine, all the work I do on all my podcasts takes a lot of time and money, and I feel like I'm at the point where I do have something I can offer people who might want to pay a little each month to help support the show. To that end, I'm starting a Patreon-exclusive podcast. The Patreon podcast will feature episodes of absolutely everything I released in one convenient feed, sometimes days early with no ads, plus a few Patreon exclusive episodes that will not be released anywhere else. iHeart Movies listeners know that from time to time I've done interviews and tangent episodes that don't really fit in with everything else I've done. They can be extremely random, and those topics never really do well with the YouTube algorithm, so in the future, those episodes will become Patreon exclusives. Q&As with me and my guests, random tangents that are far off the topic of our main episodes, and sometimes random episodes on topics exclusively for Patreon, maybe even about non-movie related things, including topics chosen by the patrons. The Patreon podcast will be $2 a month, but for $5 a month, I will also give listeners the chance to choose episodes, and not just Patreon exclusives. You'll be able to pick movies covered on the main podcast. Do you have a favorite film you want to hear me and my friends talk about? Do you know an obscure cartoon you think more people need to discover? Do you want a tier list of our favorite LaCroix flavors? Then sign up for Patreon and request to your heart's content. I will even be revealing upcoming series topics for every version ever, so patrons will have the chance to make sure I cover versions that they want me to talk about, from stories I've already covered like Little Women or War of the Worlds, to brand new stories that I will eventually get to like Pride and Prejudice or Oliver Twist. When I set what the next series is going to cover, patrons will be the first to know so they can get their requests in. I've covered countless versions of Alice in Wonderland over the years. It's consistently one of the most popular things I do online, and I will probably do a few more later this year as well, so if you have a favorite one that I haven't gotten to yet, this is your chance to make sure it happens. I will do my best to honor all requests on all 4 podcasts, as well as get whichever of my regular guests you might want me to record with, if you have a preference. Things may change in the future, but I'm not expecting a ton of patrons right away, so whoever jumps on this first will potentially have their pick of episodes for a while. I have so many ideas for the new Patreon podcast, so I hope you'll join me. I'd love as much involvement from my listeners as possible, so I hope to see you there. Okay, I think that's all I have for announcements right now, at least as far as new content is concerned. But before we go, let's talk a bit about what you can look forward to in the coming year. On iHeart Movies, like I said, a lot of the content will be dual releases with the other 3 shows, but you will definitely still get some new episodes on stuff not covered under the Disney, animation, or literary banners in the other podcasts. One of the first brand new episodes you can expect will be continuing my series with Nikki from Trivial Theater on Star Wars. We just recorded an episode on The Phantom Menace, and I'm hoping to get all the way through the prequel trilogy this year, and maybe even do a few others. Definitely no promises until we actually get through the prequels, but I know Nikki and I would like to get into some Star Wars TV series, and Katie Fabric and I have actually talked about some Star Wars animated projects before, so we might bring her on at some point to talk about something in the future as well. We'll see what happens. On Every Version Ever, starting next month, we will be doing Pinocchio. I had originally planned for this to happen last year, but the end of the year got to be too busy and I had to postpone it. 2022 saw the release of 3 brand new versions of Pinocchio, so it would have been so perfect to do it last year. But there's no time like the present, so all those versions and more will be up for discussion as soon as we launch the series. On the Disney Movie Marathon, we will pick up where we left off in the Disney canon and jump right into the wartime era. or the package film era, whichever one you prefer. It goes by both names. As soon as I get a chance to edit it, I will have a brand new episode for you. Mark Brown and Eli Sands join me to talk about the wartime era as a whole, and then we will go film by film, starting with Saludos Amigos. When iHeart Animation launches, I'm planning to eventually do a mix of newer episodes as well as older ones, but for the first few weeks of the podcast, I will be re-releasing a bunch of early stuff week by week, starting with all the Q&As I did with my most frequent co-hosts way back in the day. I actually have also recorded 2 new ones, an update to one with me and Sarah, and then Eli Sands and I had never done one. So those will be among the first new episodes, and those 2 actually will also be part of iHeart Movies, because I have to include these new interviews with me, Sarah, and Eli in the main podcast. After we get through the Q&As, we'll do a week of random episodes from the past couple of years, and then we'll do a bunch of animation episodes from every version ever, and then any applicable episodes of the Disney Movie Marathon will also be coming to iHeart Animation, so I'll probably do at least a week of that, just to get things rolling, before we move to a more consistent schedule. Okay, that is everything you can look forward to in 2023, at least as far as I have planned for the moment. I have so much in the works. I'm going to be so busy, but I love doing this, and even though it's a ton of work, it's also a ton of fun. So thank you so much for all your support in 2022, and I look forward to bringing you a whole new batch of episodes in 2023. Thanks for listening. We will see you soon.